Who forgot to say Mary to Thomas and Mary to Geshem today?
You're supposed to.
Well, somebody said Mary to Geshem. You weren't supposed to. How else did it end up raining?
Somebody said.
Not good. It's not supposed to rain now.
Is it not a good
Why
sign?
is
It's not a good sign.
Why is it not a good sign?
It's not for an outside.
Nope. It's only for us when it happens in the rainy season.
So what is it in non-rainy
But
season?
did you get some training?
All I know is that it says that if you ask for rain in the summer, you gotta go back and change your Shemona Esrei, 'cause you're not allowed to do that.
You're not allowed to ask for rain in the summer. What if it's
Why
like
is
a
it-
preventative thing because it was windy?
I don't make the rules.
Why is it a big stop on that?
What?
Why is it like stop on that?
I don't know. I don't know enough about agriculture in the rain to tell you. I don't. That's cool.
Okay.
Alright. Okay. Where are we going? Getting close to the end of the chapter. In a sense, we're more than halfway through. Alright. We left off with discussing the meaning of Job's statement that God created the wicked, meaning that God proactively ensures that some people must contend with the thoughts and temptations of the wicked, and that they will never be able to escape that. Can you know ahead of time if that's you? No. But if you start to feel frustrated that despite your deep love for Hashem and prioritizing Him in all of your decisions,
Yeah.
and that you never do anything against what He wants, never compromise that relationship, not in what you do, not in what you say, or even what you allow yourself to think, and yet lewd and heretical thoughts bombard you from time to time as you're going through the market, trying to do your grocery shopping, etc., etc., etc. You should realize that perhaps this is in fact God intentionally setting up the situation where you can do that profound mitzvah of not turning astray after your thoughts, which subdues the sitra achar below, which elicits God to subdue the sitra achar above, which makes God feel amazing. And since you love God, you should feel amazing that you're helping God feel amazing. And therefore you shouldn't feel that somehow this reflects so badly on you. Good? That's kind of what we're holding.
Just like let it go.
That's
It's
not
a big deal.
That's not what I said. It's a big deal. It's a very big deal.
But you said you shouldn't something so much about.
You shouldn't think that it reflects so poorly on you.
Right. You
But it's a
shouldn't
very big deal.
identify with it so much.
More than that, it's more than that. In other words, I want to differentiate. There's I want to actually before, but this is important. It is important to differentiate between mental health and religious service of God. Not that there's no overlap or interplay between the two, but they're not the same. They do not have the same objectives. Having a sense that yourself is deeper, richer, and more complex than any one train of thought or even any one behavior that you've engaged in is an important part of maintaining a decent, functional, healthy psyche, which I would argue is definitely subsumed in the ideas that we've been studying in this chapter. But this is arguing something different. This is saying that there is actually deep cosmic and divine significance to the fact that you're having these thoughts, and that cosmic significance is not entirely negative as it would appear, but is mostly positive. Not entirely positive, but mostly positive. Right? And therefore, one should rejoice that they are in fact doing something that brings God pleasure, and that realize that the fact even that they're in this situation is God's active doing. God is bringing them into this situation for that purpose. And while that does mean that their relationship with Hashem is compromised in one sense, it also means that they're bringing Hashem tremendous pleasure. And in another sense, and again, that's something that is active, intentional thing on God's part. And when you frame it that way, it's a very big deal. But it's a very big positive deal. Okay. This is so much so, I mean, just even though this is for right now, this is so much so that the Alter Rebbe later on in the chapter is going to start speaking out, what about those of us who don't contend with heretical and lewd thoughts? How can we do the same thing for God?
Totally.
If it's such an amazing thing, why should those of us who are feeling, all spiritually enlightened and whatever, what do we do?
That's
I was gonna ask, like,
What? You weren't going to ask that question, right?
I want a question.
Sounds like what?
And no way question.
it could also, I feel like, be very subtly like a setup for someone to like indulge in stuff, right? And then
Oh, so that's why the Alter Rebbe at one point he says you should rejoice, and the other point, like in the chapter, he says you shouldn't bother you so much. Or the way I phrased it is it's mostly positive. Right? In other words, if the minute you start to think of this as an entirely positive thing, right,
Yeah.
that having a lewd thought and having
Right.
matzah on Pesach are identical, well then that can lead you down a very bad path.
very bad path.
Which again, I'm not disagreeing that it's an important thing for the ability to just realize a thought is a thought and let it go, and that is an important technique as being a functional adult. But in the religious context, our thoughts do have meaning, and the question is how should we frame that meaning? And again, presuming that you're doing what you're supposed to be doing, how should we frame that? That's what I was dealing with. Now, what we have to deal with today is the following question. Okay? Which is a development which is kind of follows from what we've been discussing, which is that it is really about giving God pleasure, whatever that means. I'm going to bracket right now what that means. God obviously is not like a kid in the candy shop who needs to eat ice cream or something, but whatever it means to give God pleasure. Why is it that we should be relegated to giving God pleasure through contending with lewd and heretical thoughts, right? Wading through the mud of our deep recesses of our subconscious, rather than bringing God pleasure the way that tzaddikim do. Because tzaddikim also give God pleasure, and they give God pleasure by creating a space of pure holiness.
Is that constant pleasure?
Is it constant pleasure?
The pleasure that tzaddikim give Hashem, it's just constant.
No, it's not constant. I'm saying it's constant pleasure.
But it's not like they're ever stopping.
Okay, I've said this before, I'm going to say this again. We have a very childish view of tzaddikim, and we need to make sure that we don't have a childish view of tzaddikim. And I've tried to explain this before, and I'm going to explain it again. I'm going to use a different analogy, okay? And I'm going to do it in a way that is slightly offensive, because I think it will drive the point home, okay? Men think that women have it easy, religious men. They don't have to get up for minyan. They don't have to say Shema on time. They don't have a obligation of Torah study. I go on and on and on and on, right? And therefore, women have it easy. Does that sound right? No. That's what happens if you're myopic and you only look at your own issues and you say, well, the absence of the issues I deal with automatically means everything is simple and smooth, right?
Yeah.
That's a silly way to look at life, right? Okay. So because the tzaddik doesn't contend with the issues that I contend with, they have their own kinds of issues. Alter Rebbe clearly, tzaddikim go through their own kinds of ups and downs and struggles and all sorts of those kinds of things, right? And then you have to realize we are very focused in Tanya on the interior life of the person for the most part. There are a few places in Tanya where the Alter Rebbe directly addresses interpersonal relationships. You have to realize tzaddikim have a much harder time with interpersonal relationships than the rest of us, which it doesn't discuss this in Tanya, but I think it's worth it. There's a very big difference between interpersonal conduct and interpersonal relationships. Tzaddikim do not have a hard time treating us nicely, treating us honestly, ethically, morally. That's not a big deal for them. If you...
Is that the conduct?
That's conduct. Now, if you found yourself on a desert island together with, say 30 kindergartners, how long would it go before you went crazy?
Not very long.
Okay, so what is it like for a tzaddik who has a totally different sense of reality, a totally different sense of God, a totally different sense of what's important, what's real, what makes sense, what doesn't make sense, to be stuck in a society with the rest of us? The Baal Shem Tov, when he was younger, avoided society and spent most of his time in the woods with animals or helping small children get to school. Rashbi stayed in the cave. it is, right, there's a Yom Yom, which is a collection of teachings of the previous Rebbe, edited by the Rebbe, where it says one of the innovations of Chassidus is that there's no loneliness, that the tzaddik isn't alone and the chassid isn't alone. Meaning that somehow that you can have an actual deep relationship between the two of them, even though they're like totally different spaces. And that's actually very hard for tzaddikim. And if you pay attention to the history of tzaddikim, when the more tzaddikim are kind of put into the open and having relationships with people, things like this, you can see there's a tremendous amount of reluctance. And it's not a kind of a selfishness, it's very hard. Right? It's very, like, again, to be calm and mature and collected and treat all the kindergartners nicely is one thing, right? But to feel camaraderie with 30 kindergartners, that's a whole other thing.
Feel
So,
very isolated.
yeah. So, I mean, tzaddikim have their own set of issues, and, you know, I mean, I wish that problem on all of us, but
Makes me think of autistic people a little bit.
there is an interesting parallel there. When tzaddikim find other tzaddikim, they create very, very deep bonds. Because it's not, unlike autistic people, it's not so much about the isolation within themselves. It's just that, you know, it's more like Adam, right? When Adam was created, he had no one. There was a bunch of animals and a bunch of plants, and there was no one else that was like him. All right, back to the text. So what we're going to be discussing is how Hashem gets two different kinds of pleasure from two different types of service, and therefore, one is not a substitute for the other. Before we get into reading the text, I want to make sure we understand the way of thinking that the author is going to be using, the method, which is a general view in Chassidus. So I'm going to ask you, from a Chassidic point of view, what is greater, Shabbos or a weekday? Wrong. From a Chassidic point of view, what is greater, the study of Torah or the doing mitzvahs? Wrong. From the Chassidic point of view, what is greater, loving Hashem or fearing Hashem? Both, right? The answer is like this, that if one thing was greater than the other, and the other thing was lesser than the other, then the lesser is superfluous and God would need to make it. Everything has its place, and so any particular Chassidic text may be looking at why one thing is greater than the other, but what they're really saying is why one doesn't replace the other. Okay? Shabbos is not a substitute for weekdays. Weekdays are not a substitute for Shabbos. Okay? Mitzvahs are not a substitute for Torah study. Torah study is not a substitute for mitzvahs. Then we could talk about the proper way of blending them and interacting with them. Okay? And this goes to all differences. Hearing is not a substitute for seeing. Emunah, belief, is not a substitute for knowing. Knowing is not a substitute for believing. Love is not a substitute for fear. Fear is not a substitute for love. You see where I'm going with this?
Yeah.
Okay. So, therefore, the way, the pleasure God gets out of the divine service of the Beni, which we're going to talk about, and the one that he gets out of the Tzaddik, they are not replaceable with each other. There is not a greater or a lesser. There are ways in which one has things the other doesn't, which is why one doesn't replace the other. And so if I really care about God, and this is key to this, if I really care about God, I care about my relationship with God, then should it really matter which one of the two I'm doing? Since God, for lack of words, has a need for both. No. There's a very famous Chassidic story, which everyone loves, and then there's another Chassidic story, which very few people know, which completely reframes the first story, and means that sometimes people don't love the story anymore. The story goes like this. Rabbi Zusha of Anapoli was a disciple of the Maggid Mizrich, very, very close friend of the Alter Rebbe. In fact, he was one of the two people the Alter Rebbe asked for an approbation for Tanya. If you open the Tanya in the beginning, he wrote a little approbation. And he was on his deathbed, and he did not have a lot of followers. His brother was a very, very big Chassidic Rebbe. It's called like the Rebbe of the Rebbes, Rebbe Menachem Lezhinsk. But Zusha didn't have the same big following. So Zusha was on his deathbed, and he's distraught, and he's crying, and his disciples are asking him, "Why are you crying?" And he says, "When I get to heaven, and they ask me, why wasn't I like Moshe Rabbeinu, I'll have an answer, and I'll just say, I'm not Moshe Rabbeinu." And ask why I wasn't like Rabbi Akiva, I'll say, well, I wasn't Rabbi Akiva. And, you know, you can add in a few names, whatever, how you want to list. But when they ask me, Zusha, why weren't you Zusha? Then what am I supposed to say? Right? You have to, God's not going to hold you to account for being someone that you aren't, but he is going to hold you account for not being who you really are. People tend to like that story because it's about authenticity and who you are, right? Okay, now, but there's another story of Rabbi Zusha which puts it in context. One time Rabbi Zusha asked his students, if you could switch places with Avraham. Yeah, Avraham Avinu. Yeah. Avraham, our forefather. Would you? Now, to be clear, if you switch places with him, you would really be Avram. Like, not you would be in his situation. You would have all of his experience, all this. You would be him, like, fully, and then he would be you. So you wouldn't even have the memory of, like, oh, it's so great I got to be Avram. You would literally be Avram. You would experience what Avram experienced. You would live his life. Right? You would be Avram, and he would be you. Would you make the trade? That's an honest answer. Why would you make the trade?
Because he's like the closest to Hashem.
Good answer. Why would you say no?
I just to me it scares me.
Right? Okay.
More responsibility.
What?
More responsibility.
Well, yeah, but you would have all, but you would be Avram, so you'd be able to manage that responsibility, right? You would have all of that. Whatever he had, you would have. Whatever he did, you would do.
He's on such a higher level.
Yeah. So I can hear one argument that he's so much closer to Hashem and it's a holy whatever, right? That's all. On the other hand, I honestly like you can't really want something that you have no concept of. I can want improvements and enhancements in my life. I can't really want to be somebody else because I have no idea what that means. I can see both sides of the argument, right? That's me. That's you. Reb Zusha's father said what he says. So Reb Zusha says that Reb Zusha then said, I don't really understand the question. Because at the end of the day, God ends up with one Avraham and one Zusha. So it doesn't really matter. In other words, when God, going back to the first story, when God says Zusha, why aren't you Zusha? It's not because of the importance of being Zusha. It's important that God has one Zusha and one Avram. And if you happen to be the Zusha, right? And so there's at the same time, there's this full-fledged embrace of being who I am and the role I have. There's also a fundamental indifference to the fact that this is my role. My role could have been something else, right? And when you have that, you have a better sense of what Reb Zusha is saying. And the Alter Rebbe is drawing on that same theme. They have the same Rebbe, which is, if you're the non-tzaddik, you're the Beinoni, how should you feel about that?
Fine.
You should feel fine. Why? For number one, you're doing this amazing thing for Hashem, and number two, if it's for Hashem, like, what does it matter whether you're playing this role, or you're playing that role? At the end of the day, he has what he wants, and if this is the one you are, you should be fully into it. But that also means, right? That also means at the same time, you don't necessarily feel that you're superior to anybody else, which leads to a very important teaching of the Mitzvah of the Alter Rebbe's son. He says that when Moshe was standing in front of Paro in Egypt, Moshe felt very humble. Why did he feel very humble? Because of Paro. Because Moshe realized God needs one Moshe and one Paro. What did I do to deserve to be the Moshe in the story? So if it wasn't for the grace of God, I would be the Paro and he could be the Moshe. And therefore, how did he feel? Extremely humbled, right? So the gratitude, the humility, there's a full embrace of it, and these all come together. And so the Alter Rebbe is saying, if Hashem values both, and they're not replaceable, so if this is the one you are, appreciate it for what it is, and you can also appreciate the other one for what it is, and it's wonderful that Hashem has the people to do that. Mm-hmm. Yes?
But there's also an aspect of like, if it's a goal for us to get that status, and it's not just your status quo, like I am unity and that's it, then like there should be a goal to get to the next level.
Okay, so I want to correct something that you're saying, which is, actually, it's not kind of the same. There's the idea that there's a next level.
No.
One second. There is an idea, which is that, well, if two things are, if each thing is has value, right, and one doesn't replace the other, the question is, how much integration does Hashem want? In other words, like this. And this, by the way, the analogy that he's going to have here is not going to be the best analogy for this point. But let's just say this. Let's say I like things that are exciting and I like things that are calm. Does that mean I want things that are pure excitement with nothing calm going on, and I want pure calm with no excitement? Or does it mean I want exciting things but a little bit of calm in them, and I want things that are calm with a little bit of excitement? And so there's this idea of what's called hiskalos, or integration, that while there is Hashem values many different things, and in a broad sense, everybody is given their place to fill that one thing. But then when you zoom in, Hashem wants a little bit of everything in everybody. So the tzaddik has to figure out how to be a little like a Beinoni, and the Beinoni has to figure out how to be a little bit like a tzaddik. And Alter Rebbe addressed that literally in chapter 14, right? How the person who's not truly a tzaddik can fulfill this being tzaddik-like to a degree. And there's discussion, not in Tanya, about how even tzaddik can incorporate some Beinoni-like qualities to it. Just one second. And this to use another example, we have the idea that there's it's called traditionally the the people who are sitting and studying Torah, and then the ballet sucking, the people who are working. But we know the people who are working have to make time to study Torah, and the people who are studying Torah have to engage the community, right? And so there's this idea that even though we are differentiating and saying this is your place, this is your place, Hashem doesn't want it to be so subdivided. What He wants is that there's a little bit of everything in everything else, and so that's why I think of it as the next level is incorrect. This is my place, this is my place. But if I zoom in on the life of Beinoni is not pure Beinoni. Beinoni has a tzaddik element and a Baal Tshuva element. And if I'm a Baal Tshuva, which is a whole discussion not here, right? Whatever Baal Tshuva is, so someone who's really thrown God in the garbage and then has to come back to God, which is a whole discussion in its own right. But in that, there's elements of everything. And that's a key second point that follows from this. If everything has value, so when Hashem zooms in on one relationship, there needs to be a little bit of what's called a me'ain, a little taste of all the different aspects in any one thing. And then that actually is what leads the different types to interact, because I can relate to something that you have, you can relate to something that I have, because we incorporate some elements of each other. Which by the way means a tzaddik even has to find a part of himself that's kind of like a rasha, right? Which I can tell you about, but someone has a question. Yes?
Can you just define tzaddik versus bearing?
I can briefly do it, but I have to keep doing it every single class when new people are coming. So I'll very briefly do it. Tzaddik, we're coming to it. A tzaddik in the context is somebody whose love for Hashem has totally transformed them, so they don't relate to anything that doesn't bring them closer to Hashem. They don't have any desires for things that aren't holy. They don't have any inclination.
So it's not defined by someone who said it's wrong.
No.
So why would you want to become more like a Beinoni?
Well, that's what we're learning. And then a Beinoni is somebody whose love for Hashem doesn't do that, but their love for Hashem makes them choose Hashem over everything else. So whenever they're faced with choices in life, on the one hand they want to do this and they want to do that, but their relationship with Hashem, their love for Hashem, is the most important thing for them, and they overcome themselves to always connect to Hashem. Okay, so they're both good people, they're both right, but there's very different flavor. So now we're going to learn how does Hashem feel about a Beinoni doing what a Beinoni does, and a tzaddik doing what a tzaddik does. Overcoming the evil versus totally transforming it. Okay. Both of them make him feel good. 4, we are on the text where it says 5 utter 1. For there are 2 kinds of gratification before him, and blessed be he. 1, from the complete annihilation of the Sitra Achra and the conversion of bitter to sweet and darkness to light by the tzaddikim. So number 1 is you get rid of the Sitra Achra. What is Sitra Achra? We learned about this last week. Not holy. Not holy. Yes. What's holy?
Anything that isn't Sitra.
So that. What is holy?
Things that
It's separate.
It's separate in what sense?
In general, what's holy?
No, in the context of Tanya, when we're understanding that Sitra Achra means the other side, meaning that which is not holy. And so what is holy? No, those are examples of one. So I want a definition of holy.
Something that has been designated by God to be used for serving Him.
Okay, good, but no. Something that has not been designated by God, something that its whole reality is centered around God. In other words, the designation, not how God is designated and decided this is for holy purposes, but that is its focus, that is its whole agenda. Right? The technical term that Alter Rebbe uses is that it is batal, it is nullified. In other words, it has no significance, agenda, or purpose or meaning in its own right. Rather, it is entirely centered around and devoted to God. So, an example of something which is not Kedusha be?
It's not.
Yeah, an example of not Kedusha? Avodah Zarah, that would be good. But I prefer a more mundane example.
More mundane.
Yes. Well, I was going to be more specific, right? Which is dessert. Because why do I eat dessert? I don't know about you. Why do I eat dessert?
It's yummy.
That's right, it's yummy. And guess what the yumminess is not all about?
Hashem.
That's right. Well, there you go.
But I don't.
We're not saying
No one likes
bad
this.
thing.
No one likes this. I'm aware of you. I don't like it either. But you know what? Reality is not come to you and say, here, please give me your opinion and we'll totally change based on what you would like. That's not how reality works. Unless you're God. And actually not even if you're God, because God decided that he's going to...
Why did he give us taste buds?
Well, I didn't say... For example, when tzaddikim eat dessert, it's a whole different thing.
Uh-huh.
Because tzaddikim, what have they done? Let's read that again. They have annihilated the sitra achra and the conversion of bitter to sweet and darkness to light. So, if a tzaddik is eating dessert,
We eat dirt and we just
no. If a tzaddik is eating dessert, then what does that mean? That the tzaddik's eating dessert is not because it's yummy. The tzaddik's eating dessert is because somehow this is about God. Now, you can see the big difference between me and a tzaddik, because I have a hard time figuring out how, the delicious cheesecake that my son made for Shabbos has anything to do with God when I'm snacking on it at 11 o'clock at night when no one's looking in the refrigerator, right? It's like, what does that have to do with God? I don't know. But the tzaddik, eating cheesecake, God. If it's not about God, then there would be no. Not even one would consider eating cheesecake. Why would you eat cheesecake? It's very hard to imagine what life is like as a tzaddik. Okay, I can give you an analogy. Okay. Okay. This is a negative analogy, but it's helpful. These people that they live online. They live online, right? Like the physical world that the rest of us live in is just like a means to get to their device, right? Like everything is like, I need a place where I can sit and the Wi-Fi and the high-speed internet access and my headset and enough food to keep me going. But I live in this virtual world, right? And the rest of us think what's wrong with you? Because their sense of reality is not oriented the same way as the rest of us. So it doesn't mean they don't care about the chair they're sitting in, but it's completely different than the rest of us, right? The chair matters in as much as the chair is going to facilitate them being totally immersed in their virtual whatever, yeah? Okay. So there's a reality of God, and then there's the world that we live in. And for the tzaddik, this world is what? Just the means to have some sort of awareness and interaction with God. And so if the yumminess of the cheesecake is facilitating that directly, then great. Otherwise, what's the point of eating? He doesn't get it. And that's not how I relate to cheesecake. I just think cheesecake is yummy, and that seems like a good enough reason to eat it, other than the fact that it doesn't have great health benefits and shows a moral weakness that I can't control my appetite. Those are things I can relate to. But if I could imagine that the cheesecake had zero negative health benefits and didn't reflect a moral weakness that I, snack on it when I shouldn't be, then what's so bad about cheesecake? It's not like I'm not hurting anybody. It's not a sin. Right? We live in a different world, subjectively. And so at tzaddik, everything they encounter, right, the whole notion that there's something other than God that is of value, that is of significance, that just disappears. It's annihilated. It's taken out of the picture, at least in their engaging the world, whether that's the external world or their own internal, what's going on inside of them. And whatever's left over, therefore, goes from, as it's called, darkness to light, from bitter to sweet. It becomes a medium through which they have a stronger connection to Hashem. Okay? And is this something that happens automatically by default? They just sit back and do nothing? No, this happens, as I mentioned before, because of their deep, passionate love for Hashem, which totally transforms their psyche, even on the levels of their deep unconscious. And as we know, love is a dynamic thing, right? It's not just, just stay with love. But that process of totally redefining what reality is in the life experience of the tzaddik is something that God gives God extreme pleasure. This thing which opposes God, because it distracts from His absolute presence, the sitra achra, is being how do they put it? Disappeared. It's being disappeared, and the shell of it that that's left over is being recycled and transformed into something that actually becomes a vehicle, a medium for Hashem to be present in the life of the tzaddik and the world the tzaddik inhabits. And Hashem thinks this is really, really cool, and it makes him feel amazing. That's not what's happening with you and me, though, because I like cheesecake. I don't know about you. The second is when the sitra achra is subdued while it's still at its strongest and most powerful and soars like an eagle. Whence Hashem brings her down through the effort of the Beinim below. Okay? The other is when the Sitra Achra is being subdued. Being subdued means that the Sitra Achra is still exerting full force. Okay? To use a metaphor, or sorry, not a metaphor, an analogy, if you have a sporting event, okay, and you're actually interested in watching an engaging sporting event, do you want one team to be at the top of physical performance and training, and the other team to be a bunch of kindergartners who don't know how to play? No, that sounds really boring to watch, right? Okay. Right. This is why, for instance, in boxing, right, they have weight classes, because if you're that much heavier than the other guy, it's like and you're playing by the rules of boxing, it's not much of a competition what's going to happen, right? So, one of the things that God gets real kick of is that the Sitra Achra being knocked down, but it's only a kick when it's knocked down, when the Sitra Achra is there to push back, right? And so that's what happens to the Bane, right? The thought enters the person's mind, and God is really pushing it on and egging it on, and then what happens? This person, the Bane, hopefully you and me, out of our deep devotion to Hashem, knocks it down. Why is it not a fair fight?
Because what if the Sitra Achra is stronger than the person?
No, actually, Sitra Achra is weaker than the person. Alter Rebbe addresses this later on. The Sitra Achra is actually, it's not a fair fight because it's like dark, light and dark. That's why God has to kind of prop the whole thing up. Really, it's like this. When I was a kid, I really liked fencing, but because A, there weren't that many places to go fencing, and B, it was expensive, and C, most of the things involved Shabbos, so I didn't actually do much fencing. But that didn't prevent me from, getting a sword and practicing and stuff. But the cool thing when you do fencing all by yourself? You always win. Because, right? But if you're fencing, what?
What's so fun in that?
I'm being facetious. But if you're fencing against a real person, you know what can happen? You could lose. And that actually makes winning meaningful, right? Hence my desire in begging my parents, can I take fencing? And it didn't work out. Childhood traumas. So the fact is, because God is the only thing that's real, so that which obstructs God, distorts God, denies God, however you want to put it, fundamentally is unreal. Really, it's not a competition, and that's why the analogy of light and darkness is used. Right? You turn on the light, the darkness can't fight back. So if it wasn't for the unfathomable infinite power of God to make the unreal have power and reality, this whole thing wouldn't work. The Alter Rebbe actually says this clearly later on. It's developed in Chassidus that it's really not a fair fight, but the other way around. Which is actually an idea I was going to get to later. So a good analogy for this, and it's only an analogy, and it's an analogy for the subjective experience, not for the metaphysics of it. Children and some adults are afraid of the dark, which is a weird thing because there's no such thing as dark.
Absence of light.
Yeah, but they're afraid of the dark.
Oh, no. And then things that come out in the dark you can't see.
One second. When the lights go off and there's no light, what do you see? Wrong. I would like you to close your eyes. Put your hand over your eyes so you can't get any light coming through. Okay? And I would like you to notice that you can still see black, but in the back of your head, you see nothing.
The back of our head?
Yeah, go like this. Like, pay attention to what's behind you. Close your eyes.
Sure.
Close your eyes. Make sure there's no light. And note that pay attention to what's behind you.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see black or you just don't see?
You just don't see.
But in your front, what happens? So you're seeing something, right? You have a subjective experience of seeing something. And that blackness,
Blind people can't see it.
I don't know about blind people. But so that blackness in some little kids and some adults, right? That experience of blackness, which is not there out there in the world, but the absence of light has a subjective experience for them of blackness. That blackness triggers fear. Now, why is it triggering fear is already another discussion, right? But they have to experience the blackness, right? If they didn't experience anything, they wouldn't be afraid. So it's not that they don't see. They see, in a weird sense, the absence, and it feels like something to them, and they have this emotional reaction to it. Okay? Except with God, it's not just like an illusion in your head, it's like actually real. So, but the point is, yes, it is unfair, but the other way around. Okay. Now, I will agree with you that to the degree that our relationship with Hashem is not a high priority for us, then it feels unfair the other way.
Yes.
If Hashem is the only thing that's giving it strength, meaning if you understand intellectually that there is not a fair fight, but like Hashem is giving it strength, so
Yeah, but why is he giving it strength?
for the fight
To be defeated. In other words, he's picked a side.
It can even give you the possibility.
This is very important. And the Alter Rebbe had in later place in Tanya develops the idea from Baal Shem Tov. When Hashem gives strength to the Sidrach, the other side, it is not that he is trying to give it reality to make it a fair fight. He is trying to make it that the victory of the good is a meaningful victory, nothing more than that. So in other words, you're guaranteed to win if you put in a real fight. If you put in a real fight. But if you don't put in a real fight,
Yeah.
then you're not, right?
It's like super addiction.
It's super what?
It's like treating addiction. It's like very much the same exact thing.
No.
I feel like.
That if you're gonna win if you put in a good, if you know you're gonna win.
Well, and it's even the spiritual component. Like if you don't have God, then you're not gonna be able to overcome it. But if you do, then you can.
So this actually becomes very important. The Alter is going to actually say this later on. In other words, it's not. There is something that is. Let me put it this way. There's a reason why certain ideas shouldn't be taught to children. They don't have mature minds. Okay? Are these thoughts, right, the enemy? And these thoughts that we're talking about battling, are they the enemy or are they not the enemy? And so what Alter Rebbe is arguing is they're not ultimately the enemy because the whole reason they're there is for you to defeat them, right? And God is making them be there so that you can defeat them. And God's giving the reality so that they can be defeated, right? And so in as much as God is what determines the reality, their thought is as real as real as they need to be to make the fight meaningful, and no more than that. There's nothing more to them. And my awareness of that, my knowledge of that is actually going to make it easier to do this.
Mm-hmm.
Right? But at the same time, right, I shouldn't think that they get too friendly with the thoughts either. Okay. So there's these two types of pleasure. One pleasure, so notice, by the way, both the pleasures involve God being against the Sitra Achra. Right? So there's one side, God is against the Sitra Achra in a sense, therefore the eradication of it, right, and the transformation of its previous domains into something which is godly is one thing godly, right? This is called in traditional language sapcha, which means transformation, and the other is the knocking the Sitra Achra down when it has the strength to put up a fight, and that's called the skafi, or subduing. Okay? And so this actually is a very important point. Before we get into the difference, I want to focus on the similarity. It seems that for God to have pleasure, there needs to be conflict. These are just two ways of the conflict being resolved. Okay, so before we go forward, there is a view that people have that the ideal would be is if I could just like carve out a little space of reality that was just pure holiness, and somehow that would be ideal. Is the tzaddik do that? Does the tzaddik carve out a space of pure holiness? No. What the tzaddik is doing is he's extending the domain of pure holiness into the domain that used to be occupied by the Sitra Achra, right? If we were to use a nasty word, the tzaddik is a colonizer, right? Whereas what the Beinoni is doing, the Beinoni is engaged in a prolonged, border war that has no resolution. But nobody's like living just calmly in their own little place, and then all that doesn't. God does not seem to be into that for some reason, which would make a certain kind of sense because if God was really into just the pure good being of God, then what would God's motivation be for creating a world that has ungodly things? It wouldn't be much of a motivation. Which therefore needs to reorient us. If I really love God and I really want to be close to God, right? I can't envision somehow like dissolving all of the stuff that's ungodly away is somehow the ideal. Even the tzaddik isn't envisioning that. What the tzaddik is envisioning is how do I, take the stuff which is ungodly and empty it of the ungodliness and then recycle it, transform it into something that is godly. I'm going to use a different analogy. Okay. Hashem gave us the land of Israel, yes? Okay. Now, there is a mitzvah in the Torah which is to conquer the land. In order to do the mitzvah of conquering the land, what do you need to have? You need to have
someone who else.
You need to have someone else who's there who doesn't want you to take the land. And therefore there's a mitzvah of actually going to war with these people, right? But the goal of that mitzvah is to do what? To eventually conquer land and get rid of them, right? To take over. Then there's another idea called galus, exile. And that's where Jews are not in their land. This is very important. Is there a mitzvah to colonize the rest of the world? To take over the rest of the world? Do we have such a mitzvah in the Torah? We don't. In fact, we have the opposite. We do have, though, an obligation to maintain our integrity in the face of, the opposition that we find when we're exiled into foreign places, into foreign lands, with foreign cultures and foreign beliefs, right? Okay. So those are right. Those are two very different things. Put in the context of idolatry for a second. Jews have a mitzvah to destroy idolatry. So if an idol, if there's an actual idol, like a real, I would say real living idol, but they're not living, so a real dead idol, I guess.
Like a little statue.
Real inanimate, yeah, like real ones. I once saw like actual idols, not from olden days, like modern idols. I saw modern idols once actually.
Yeah, they're everywhere.
Really?
A little Buddhism store.
Well, I went into a Buddhism store. I have a.
I live in Los Angeles.
Well,
Yeah.
First
or
off-
around town,
I've
Hindu people with-
yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
and so anyway, so yeah, I have a uncle whose wife's brother married a Korean woman, unfortunately. Not just because Korean, because she's Gentile. I mean, if she was Jewish, it would be fine. And they engage in ancestor worship. And so there's like a part of the house where she has these little like idols that are the ancestors, and she does ancestor worship in. That's an actual idol stuff. Yeah. So here's the rule: Jews have a mitzvah to destroy idols, like actually destroy them. Take a hammer, smash the whole thing.
Melt them down. If they're metal. I don't know.
Well, yeah, but then you can't use the metal. It's the whole thing. You can't use the metal afterwards. There's a tractate called the Vedazar, the Laws of Idolatry,
Yeah.
and it's not theological. It's about which statues you're allowed to break, you're allowed to keep, and which ones you have to break, and stuff like that. Anyway, do we have to go idol hunting? That's the question. No? Sure.
We should go
Idol
out
hunting or-
Seeking idols and destroy
No.
them. Search and destroy.
No.
Depends.
Oh.
What does it depend on?
If it's in our
Purpose?
land.
If it's in our land. In our land, we have to go seek down and destroy all the idols. Now, do we have to get ourselves thrown in an Israeli prison to do this? No, it's not that kind of mitzvah. So, in terms of modern day, do you have to go down and hunt down the idols?
Like destroy all the yoga studios.
Right. So you're not. So there's no obligation to do so because it's not because there's no obligation per se. It is a legal obligation, but you can be exempted from the obligation because it's not the kind of thing that you have to like get yourself thrown into prison over.
You're gonna say you told us.
I'm not telling you
Lord
anything.
Christ.
But if you were, say, I don't know, like let's say, I don't know, your name was Yehoshua, and you have an army, you might actually have this thing where you should go and destroy all the idols, right? And the same thing, what caused a lot of the friction between the Romans and the Jews? The Romans put a Roman eagle up on top of the entrance to the base of Mikdash, and that caused a very, very big riot, and lots of people died, and it's very unpleasant. But if you're living in New York, do you have an obligation to go hunt down the idols? No. But what if the idol comes into your domain?
Yes.
I mean, your legal
house.
possession. Your legal possession. Do you have to destroy it?
Yeah.
So you see there's a difference here? In other words, there's one is like, there's a reality of idol worship, and it's there, and it's full force, and people have idols, and like, okay, look. But if it starts to encroach onto me, then I have to knock it down. That's like the Beinoni. And then there's a reality of idol worship, and I have to go eradicate the idol worship and transform it into an idol worship-free zone, right? And that's like the tzaddik, right? The tzaddik is encountering the world, which has sitra achra in it, and what is he doing? He's encountering his inner world, he's encountering the outer world, and what is he doing? He's eradicating it, he's cleansing it of the idolatry, right? And transforming that into a place of holiness. What is the Baini doing? The Baini is maintaining a boundary and knocking down any encroachment. But then there's another encroachment, knocks it down, another encroachment, knocks it down, right? But there's not going out and actually taking over anything, not transforming anything. And God sees this conflict with sitra achra, this conflict with idolatry, this conflict with that which is not focused on God as the thing that he finds delightful, pleasurable, meaningful. But it takes on two forms, and those forms are not higher and lower, they're just different, such that one doesn't replace the other. Okay? What is the scriptural basis for this idea? This is indicated in the verse, and make for me delicacies as I love. The word matamim, delicacies, in the plural, to indicate two kinds of gratification. Okay? So when he says, make for me delicacies, that's because he wants both. Not one, not the other, but both. Okay, now who said make for me delicacies?
Hashem.
No. Yitzchak, our forefather Yitzchak. They didn't put the footnote here, right? These are the words spoken by Isaac to Esav. So this goes back to the story that Yitzchak wants to give Esav a blessing. Remember the story? And he says, but before I give you a blessing, I want some tasty food, so go make for me delicacies that I like. And he says it in plural. And then Esav goes to get the delicacies, and Yaakov sneaks in before he gets back, he gets the blessings. Okay. So in the Zohar, this is understood not just in the way it is in the pshat, the narrative between the man Yitzchak and his oldest son Esav, but this is, as it goes on to say, these are the words of the Shekhinah to her children, the community of Israel, as explained in the Tikkunim, which is a section of the Zohar. Okay. I'm not going to go into this at great length, but I've mentioned this before in other classes, that according to Kabbalah, everything that you read in the Torah is understood as referring to different spiritual Kabbalistic realms and things, right? So every character and every event is not just the physical thing on earth. So Achashverosh is Hashem, or at least Hashem is a particular issue of the world. Haman is a particular thing. Esav is a particular thing. Everything's a particular thing, and you have to figure out what it is. And so the Zohar understands this is not just Yitzchak talking to his son Esav, but as the divine presence speaking to the community of the Jewish people. Now, emphasis on the word community, because the community means there are many Jews. So some of us are going to go get one type of delicacy, the tzaddikim, and the rest of us are going to get the other type of delicacy, and that would hopefully be those of us who are abandoning, or trying to be. Okay, now, we still haven't explained what is different about these two types of pleasure, these two types of delight. From Hashem's perspective. Right? We also haven't explained what it means that Hashem has delight and pleasure. Right? We're just projecting our own humanity onto God. Now, you have a choice. Option one is we could go into the differences between the two, which is what the text goes on to do. The option two is we could talk about what it means to give Hashem pleasure, just as a principle, and then we can go back into the text. We're going to have to do both. Question the order in which you want to do. Anyone have a preference? Talk about what it means God gets pleasure? Okay. Fine. Okay. Now, whenever we talk about God and we want to understand something, the way Chassidus will use analogies. The way the analogies are supposed to be used. When I say supposed to use, I mean they're always used this way? No. The way they're supposed to be used is the analogy is meant to be deconstructed. And you have some sort of concept of interaction, of relationship. And then you use that as a model to understand that something like that is what's going on with Hashem. I'm going to use a simple example, okay? When you get angry, this is usually because somebody has done something that you think that they should not have done, right? That is a usual reason people get angry, yes? or something has happened that you think should not have happened, right? Okay. Not something happened you didn't expect to happen. That's a different thing, right? It shouldn't have happened, right? It's not supposed to be that way. That's why we get angry. Yes, good. When we get angry, we become myopic, which means we focus in on one thing at the exclusion of others, right? And we act based on that, right? So we tend to focus on the thing that bothers us, not the future, not the past, right? That specific thing. We don't look at the wider context, yes?
Yeah.
Yes? Okay. When we sin, does God get angry? What does that mean? Well, sinning means we violated God's will, right? God says you should, let's say, you should not eat the pork, and then the Jew went and ate the pork. So, and as a result of that, God's relationship, God's interaction with the world is going to be more myopic. Now, if something is more myopic, is there going to be more harmony or more friction? So the result is that God's governance of the world relating to that person will be more focused on this thing as opposed to and not taking everything else into account. And the result is things are going to be better for that person in their life and their community, or things are probably going to be worse. Worse. Does that mean God has the physiological experience of anger that we have? No, but you see what I did was you abstract certain things from one and apply them to the other. Okay? Okay? Have you ever noticed when things go the way you want, especially when it wasn't necessarily something that you expected to happen, right? You tend to have a much broader or generous perspective on the rest of things, yeah? More accommodating. You didn't realize that you were going to get a raise, and then you get a raise. Are you more likely to come, to come to wherever your friends are hanging out and saying, let's go out and celebrate? You're more likely to be less judgmental about that person who really annoys you usually, right? You tend to be more open, more accommodating, more integrated. Right? Okay, so what do you think happens when we do mitzvahs, especially beyond our natural inclination? How does God's relationship or interaction with the world? He becomes more like that. Okay? Does that mean to say that he experiences the same kind of experiences that we embodied human beings have when we feel, happy because life took a positive turn? No. You know what I'm saying? Like, in other words, what is it? In other words, we don't really know what we're talking about, right? With this, like SATs, A is to B, as B is to C, right? So, if you've never been to London, has anyone here not been to London? Good. Okay, so you've never been to London. Those who have not been to London, have you been to New York? Okay, so New York is like London.
Really?
Yeah. New York is like London. What? New York is like London. It's a big city, right? It has a lot of different. Areas. It has commerce. It has more suburban areas. There's a lot of different kinds of cultures and classes that are there. Now, does that mean if you've been to New York, you know exactly what London is like? No. But if you didn't know anything what London was like, and I told you it's like New York, and it's not like, let's say, it's not like Alan Shvut. You ever been to Alan Shvut? Shvut is like a small yeshuv in the West Bank. So I've never been to London. It's not. But if you've been to a big metropolitan city that has a lot of international commerce, right? There is something that is similar between all of them, right? And that so even though I still don't know what it's like to be in London, really, right? I'm oriented around that, right? You see what I'm saying? You have to abstract from one and apply it to the other, but it doesn't mean they're the same thing. Okay? Good? So what is pleasure in a human being? If we're calling it pleasure, that's because pleasure, delight, whatever, that's because what's happening in us, in our phenomenological experience, is the analogy for what's going on with God. But it's not the same thing. Good? Okay. So what happens what is going on when we have pleasure? So number one, pleasure is not a thing that exists out there in reality. Okay? and I'm going to start with a few different examples. This is a hat, this is a table, this is a book. Those are actual things that exist out there as objects. Good? And because they're objects and they exist out there in reality, I can give you the book, you can take the book, right? Now, what about ideas? Are ideas things that exist out there in reality? And sure, right? I mean, you read a book and you got some ideas. So there was some. Now, it's not the same as a physical object, but there's some notion of like the idea having a kind of reality to it. Thus, we can transfer the idea from my mind to your mind, right? What about emotions? What about let's say longing? It's a good emotion. Sure. I mean, you can write a poem, right? And someone can read the poem, right? And the poem brings them to right? And we understand this as there's some kind of connection or communication happening. Pleasure is fundamentally different in that pleasure does not a thing that exists. It is a state of you. You cannot share pleasure with someone else. What Chassidus is talking about when we say pleasure. Moreover, you cannot be shared. Let me. It means like this. If I read a book and I really enjoyed the book, how do I share my enjoyment with you? Not inform you that I enjoyed it. If I read a book and I understood some insight, right, I could write it down, you could read it, and then you could have the insight. Right? If I read a book, right, and I felt very angry about it, or very happy that the book was written, right, I could write something down or say something that could also make you angry or happy, right? But the fact that I enjoyed the book, how do I give you that enjoyment? Which just sounds weird. Like that's not a thing you can give. It's a state of my own being. This is the first thing to understand: is that pleasure is not a thing.
It's so subjective that everyone
No. Because what pleasure is just like I can take the book. It's a thing, and I can give it to you. There are things which are not physical, but they have a reality to them. What they are. We can talk about what an idea is. We can talk about what love is like. Pleasure is really just is the way somebody is in the moment. And so I was that way. You weren't that way. And even if we're both having pleasure at the same time, my pleasure is mine and your pleasure is yours.
Is there any other emotions like that?
No, it depends how Chassidus doesn't use the word emotion, but if you want to use the word midos that Chassidus uses, then no, it's not called the midah. What else is like that? As a general rule, so tiny pleasure is like that. Ratzon, will, is like that. Emunah is like that. Okay. And what the reason for this is that these things are very subjective in the old use of the word subjective.
Is anger like that?
Anger is not like that. Anger is definitely not like that. When you're a parent, you see this very quickly. You get angry, and immediately when you get angry, your family members get angry. And then you calm down, and you're like, oh, I'm calm now. So like, why aren't the rest of you calm? It's like, because we're still angry. Because that's what happens. Like, that's one of the things. Emotions are one of the reasons. Chassidus actually says like emotions are things like when you give an emotion to somebody, like they still have it even when you. And this like creates a lot of problems in relationships. Like you got angry for whatever reason, and you snapped at someone, you yelled at someone, whatever it is, you rolled your eyes, whatever it is, right? And they felt that. They felt that anger, and then that they took that in for themselves, right? And now you moved on, you dealt with it, but they still have their version, right? Or it's like I have an idea. And it makes a lot of sense to me. I teach a class. 10 years later, I've reconsidered, I don't think it's true anymore, but all my students who learn the idea still think it's true, right? Because the idea is a thing. It has some substance to it, okay? But pleasure is not that. Pleasure is subjective, and I don't mean it like in the sense of you matter of your personal opinion. I mean in the old sense of the word subjective, which is like this, okay? Do you ever wonder why the word where the word subjective comes from? What? Yeah, it comes from the word subject. And what does the word subject come from? Sub is under. Like, how did the word under? Okay? It's a weird thing. Sub means under. Subject is that which is under. Subjective means that which pertains to that which is under. That's what the words mean. So what is all that about? Okay? I'll mention one other word, yeah? Everyone knows what objective is, yeah? Objective relates to an object. Do you ever think it's funny that we also use the word object and objective, which refer to goals.
Mm-hmm.
Like, what's your objective? Anyway, there's a reason for this. So ideas like this, yeah. Let's talk about any sort of thing that involves a relationship, a simple relationship, right? So what we're going to say is the teacher of Mayanot Women's Tanya class speaks to his students. Good. So speaking is the kind of relationship we're talking about, right? Okay. The object, right? The speaking is aimed at the student, so it's the object, right? Okay. Now, who's doing the speaking? The teacher of Mayanot Women's Tanya class. Right? Now, here's the thing. Is that me? Okay. Would that sentence be true if somebody else taught the Tanya class? Because if there was some other person who taught the Tanya class, and would the same sentence be true? That the teacher of Mayanot Women's Tanya class is teaching the students.
Yes.
Yeah. But it wouldn't refer to me anymore, right? So underneath the phrase, the teacher of the Mayanot Women's Tanya class is actually Rabbi Kaufmann, right? But now let's go deeper. Underneath Rabbi Kaufmann, like, is me, right? If there was some other person called Rabbi Kaufmann, it wouldn't be me, right? The sentence would be true, right? So you keep going down and down and down. What's underneath that? Until you get to someone, right? That specific someone is underneath all of those words, right? And that is the subject that you're referring to. So when I say, right, the teacher of Mayanot says, what I'm really talking about is myself. Right? Does that make sense? Now, and that's what sentences are. They're saying things about something or someone. And the thing that underneath it all, literally underneath it all, is the subject. Which if you start thinking about it that way, what's the most real thing that you're referring to is the subject. That's the thing you're starting with. That's the ground, and you're building up. So you build up how you describe the subject. Rabbi Kaufmann, the teacher of the whatever, right? And then what relationship does it have with other stuff? Yes? Okay? So when we're talking about Tainug, what we're talking about is something that doesn't have a relationship with something else. Pleasure doesn't have something else. It's that underlying being is in a particular state. That's just the way they are. And so there's nothing to share, there's nothing to give. It's the state of their being. It's like saying, you know, Rabbi Finkelstein is alive, Rabbi Finkelstein is dead. This is your state of being. Okay? Right? But if I say Rabbi Finkelstein has an idea, okay, that's where he has a relationship with this other thing, and now that thing is an object, and that object can be transferred from you to him, right? Him to you. So pleasure, it's not really a thing. And because pleasure is not really a thing, we really need to understand is what's changing in the state of being, rather than like what are you gaining and what are you losing. Right? One of the reasons why people often object to the idea of us giving God pleasure is like, what do you mean? God doesn't need anything. God doesn't get anything. God's perfect, right? Okay. That's a good objection if we say we're giving God ideas. That would imply he didn't have those ideas before. That would be a good objection for saying we're giving God flowers. That would imply that he needed some flowers and didn't have any, right? But that's not what pleasure is. Pleasure is not a thing. It's a state of his being. And now we have to understand what is that state. What's different between being in a state of pleasure and not being in a state of pleasure? But you're not giving someone something they didn't have. That's the first thing you need to understand. It's not, and I know this, by the way, if you understand this, what you'll start to realize is that nothing can really give you pleasure. Even though we end up eliciting pleasure or bring ourselves into a state of pleasure by interacting with things, at the end of the day, the pleasure is not really coming from anything else. Okay. So what is pleasure? Pleasure is like this. When you are having a deeply pleasurable experience, certain things are true. Number one, how concerned are you with the problems in the world and in your life? More concerned or less concerned? And the greater the pleasure? How much internal conflict and strife do you feel? More or less? Less. right? So as you experience more pleasure, what happens is your sense of being moves to a more unified, whole, complete, perfect state. And also, by the way, to be fair, your awareness of the importance of things outside of you fades away. For instance, if you're reading a good book and you're having a lot of enjoyment, the fact that you needed to be somewhere at a particular time melts away, yes? So what's happening is that somehow your conscious experience of reality is coming into a state of wholeness, completeness, wholeness in the sense that it's not missing anything, right? Unified, harmonious, right? It happens to feel good, but the feeling good is not really the point that I'm getting at. And usually what triggers that is when we encounter something in the world that resonates with us, right? So you eat food, since you're a living being that would, God forbid, die without food, and now there's food, so your body has now what it needs, and that triggers a little bit of this state of pleasure. You read something and it makes sense to you, right? So that triggers some of this pleasure. But really, those are triggering. What really pleasure is that the consciousness of the person, the experience of the person, is being brought into a state where everything is perfect, everything is whole, everything is complete. Which, by the way, means you don't need anything in the future, right? Like, why are we future focused? Right? Because we're missing. Like, when are you worried about grocery shopping? If you're like a regular person, when you see the food's running out, right? You have to like use a lot of conscious energy to like be conscious that you should go grocery shopping before the food runs out. Right? It's called planning ahead, right? But even then, you have to bring to mind the lack of the future, right? When do we walk around with feelings of guilt and pain and remorse and regret and anxiety? When we are thinking about things that were, right? Things that will be, right? The more persons in pleasure, the less they exist in the past mentally, the less they exist in the future mentally, the less the present is in conflict with them, externally and internally. And so their consciousness becomes in this kind of this state of wholeness, of harmony. And there are things that can help trigger this in people, but that's beside the point for right now. And when I'm in that state, I'm in that state. When I'm not in that state, like, well, what do you want from me? Like if I was in that state and you're not, like, I can't give you my state of being. It's ridiculous. So what happens when let's reverse this. Now, what happens when you're not having pleasure? Well, you're aware of lack. You're aware of division, right? You have context of there's past that needs to be dealt with. There's future that needs to be addressed, right? There's internal conflict that you're aware of. There's external conflicts that you need to deal with, right? Yes, does it make sense? Okay. So again, there's pleasure and there's what triggers the pleasure. We're setting aside what triggers the pleasure is to a different discussion. So we can rank pleasure now. How do we rank pleasure? The more unified, whole, complete the sense of being is, the less there's a sense of the past and the future, the less there's a sense of conflict. Okay. If you ever have food that you really like, and there's like that first bite, and there's like this brief instant where like all is well in the universe, and then it disappears. Okay. So it's very low level pleasure. Not just low level because it lasts for a very little period of time. It also doesn't, it doesn't go as deep. And there's a whole discussion in Chassidus about different levels of pleasure, form of pleasure, okay? But what that is, so if I were to now abstract the thing, pleasure is the underlying unity and wholeness of our being, of our soul, being manifest in our conscious experience. That's what it is. It's not really so really it's entirely within yourself. Like you have this conscious experience of life, and then there's this deep part of you which is always perfect and whole. And as that, think of that like the sun, and as it radiates outward, and the more purely it radiates into your consciousness, and the more it floods your consciousness, and that's what you experience, then you're having more pleasure. And that's, I'm sure, biologically facilitated with all sorts of things like dopamine and oxytocin and blah, 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 but whatever. So when we talk about God having pleasure, what are we talking about? We're talking about the truth of God's essential unity radiating out into God's relationship with reality. Think about it. You have this relationship with the world, right? You interact with things, you want things, you do things, you talk to people, blah, 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 right? Okay? And then we're saying there's some sort of deep level of our being where everything is perfect and everything is whole, call it the essence of your soul, whatever you want. And sometimes you feel more of that, and that actually kind of sucks you in, and you feel that, and that's what pleasure is. And it can come in different forms, and it can relate to different things, and be triggered in different ways. When God relates to the world, there's a built-in paradox, which is God is perfect and whole and complete, and the world is not. So if God is engaging the world, then in as much as we're going to speak about God's awareness or God's consciousness, God's awareness and consciousness is also focused on that the fracture in the world, the conflict in the world, and also the conflict between the world and God. What would it mean for God to have pleasure? That the absolute perfection and wholeness of his being radiates into that conscious engagement with the world. So are you giving God something he didn't have? You're not really giving something he didn't have. It's not like...
Wouldn't that be a different feeling to you? Like a different form of the realization, like the actualization of the pleasure? Because it seems like it's going to happen within you as opposed to something that aligns from within you to the outside.
No, so the thing is, it's happening within you to the outside. The problem is you have to realize, you have to locate your consciousness as the outside. The problem with understanding pleasure is that we tend to think of the consciousness as the inside.
Consciousness is outside.
The consciousness is outside of you, right? There's the you who, in other words, it's like this, yeah? If you're having a thought, right? The conscious experience of the thought is not the same thing as the thinker. Right? There's the thinker and there's the thought. Okay? So in the conscious experience where the thought is taking place is not the thinker. The thinker possesses that, whatever the relationship that is. And so pleasure is what's happening is that where like the perfection of the thinker is permeating the thought. Okay? So the problem is, I'm going to draw it like this. We tend to think of it like this. There's a bunch of layers. Okay. So we'll say like this is the outside world over here, right? And this is the inner. That's what's going on inside us. So like there's where my car got smashed into, and there's where like I'm having angry thoughts about it. Okay, and then what's happening? Then there's me. Yeah. Now, we tend to think of how do things work. Things work, the outside world comes and has an impact on the inner world, right? That's like the angry car, making me upset. And then, things from the inner world then affect the outside world. So then, because I'm upset, I like yell at somebody. And we tend to think of everything working in that route, yes? What is pleasure, the way Chassidus understands what pleasure is? It's when this part starts coming out over here. Because the me is never, that underlying me is not broken, it's not fractured, it's not controlled, it's perfect, it's fine. And so when that kind of comes forth, like radiated out like the sun, and so what's happening, my inner world becomes much more an expression of the me and less about the back and forth of the outside world. That's what we call pleasure. And all sorts of things can trigger that. So we're talking about, now we go back to God, and you said this, okay. So you have God, and then you're going to have the world, and then we're going to have this middle space, which we're going to call God's mind, right? God's mind, right? God has a relationship with the world, right? So he thinks about what's going on in the world, right? Reacts to what's going on in the world, whatever that is, yeah? So what would mean that God is having pleasure? That means not that we're giving something to God, but what's happening? God's essential being floods the mind, and so therefore God's mind is in a state of perfect unity and harmony and wholeness. Now, what's important to realize is, if you're God, you create reality, right? So what's ever happening in God's mind is going to therefore play out So that will continue. And what will that bring to the entire universe? What? True unity and peace. Are we giving God something that he didn't have? No. Okay. In other words, to put this in other language, giving God pleasure means revealing a deeper level of God's being. It doesn't mean that God was missing something and now he has it.
It's in relation to us.
Well, first off, no, it's because there's an idea that God has a kind of awareness of himself also. But it kind of comes down, right? And so the question is, how far does it spread and how deeply? Just like, with human pleasures, you can have deeper pleasures, shallow pleasures, pleasures that take over your whole being, pleasures that permeate your interactions with other people. I mean, you can tell, it's like some people, when they're involved in something, you can just feel that they're at peace with themselves, they're whole with themselves, they're in some kind of a flow state or whatever, and some people not, right? Okay. Yeah.
Are you saying that when we have pleasure, not gas?
No, it's an analogy. If we understand our pleasure and we abstract conceptually how that makes sense according to Chassidus, then that's a model to what's happening with Hashem. It doesn't mean you have pleasure, God has pleasure.
Yeah, okay. And how is like you said, how would we, I guess you would say, reveal a deeper level of God's
So the text said, there are two things that trigger God's pleasure. One is when we take the realm of unholiness, conquer it, and transform it into something holy, and that's the tzaddikim. Or the other is when we subdue the incursions of the unholiness into our life, and that's what the Beinoni does. And what he wants to point out is that the pleasures actually come in flavors. Not that pleasure comes in only one form.
What would you say?
When we maintain that boundary and we don't let our lives be taken over by the unholy things, we subdue the unholiness. And so these two things elicit the pleasure. But what he wants to now explain is that the pleasure doesn't come in one form. There's actually two forms of pleasure, which is a weird idea, but we'll get to that later. So it's not the case that God is sitting around and saying, I'm missing something in life. I don't have pleasure. I need someone to give me pleasure. Oh, you did something, now I have pleasure. What it is, in fact, is God is saying, I have decided that rather than me self-initiating, radiating my absolute being into all of existence on my own, I'm going to have set it up that what you do is going to trigger that because of God's value of having a relationship with us and a connection to us. And so this inherent wholeness of God's being radiating out into God's mind and his relationship with the world, some of it can be self-initiated. That's, for example, Shabbos is an example where he self-initiates it. And some of it happens through what we do. Okay? And by the way, this also plays out in human relationships, right? When you have a deep relationship with someone, that what you means is you are allowing what they do to be a trigger of the pleasure. And when you cut yourself off from a relationship, what you're doing is you're saying that what they do will not affect that. But at the end of the day, the pleasure is not coming from them. The pleasure is bringing your experience of your own life and being into greater awareness of like the underlying truth that you are whole, you are complete, right? That there's the past is not the end of the world. The future is not a problem you need to focus on. By the way, pleasure has its downsides, right? And pleasure conducive for being productive to a degree. Too much pleasure completely takes you out of the notion of past, present, future completely. And if you're completely out of the notion of past, present, future, there's no idea of doing or accomplishing anything, right? Notice on Shabbos, we're not supposed to do anything or achieve anything. Shabbos is all about being in tone with the fact that Hashem is having pleasure. Fine.
What does it say? Tanya?
It says nachas ruach,
Yeah.
which is broadly speaking a synonym. And nachas ruach literally means the resting of the spirit. The spirit is coming out into. It's like,
I don't really understand this idea of your conscience being outside of you.
that is a very difficult thing. A person needs to spend a lot of time thinking about it. I will give you a point to consider, is that your consciousness is something that has things occur in it. You are aware of objects, you're aware of feelings, you're aware of ideas, you're aware of words, you're aware of sensory experiences, right? So your consciousness is somewhat shared with the not you. Because the occupants of your consciousness are things other than you. their thoughts, feelings, ideas, sensory experiences. So the place that's just you, that's just pure you, can't be conscious.
What is pure?
What is pure means it's nothing else. Now, I don't like doing comparative religion, but I will say the following. You have basically two choices if you think about this deeply. One choice is to realize that you are beyond consciousness, and the other is to deny that you exist.
I'm saying like what is you?
That's exactly the point. You will not be able to know what you is, because to know what something is, it has to take place where? In your consciousness. So I do have to acknowledge that consciousness is not the end all and be all, and there is a you beyond consciousness. That's the view that what?
There's a me beyond my
Yes. So whenever Chassidus talks about your etzem, your very self, it's something beyond your conscious.
I thought it was your soul.
Is that your
Soul. It depends. It gets used in different ways. I don't know. If I am aware, then awareness is something that is more than just I. And if I am aware and my awareness is always of something, then awareness is a place that on the one hand is mine, it's my awareness, but on the other hand, it's a place where things other than me can be, because I'm aware of something. So it's you know, like you have olive oil and it's not pure because other stuff is mixed into it. Consciousness is not pure you. So if there is a pure me, it's beyond consciousness.
and I cannot know what it is.
Correct. It's not knowable. By the way, by this logic, can God know what he is? If you take this, if you take it,
Well,
you know what it says in the Zohar? The highest level is called Resha Delayis Yada, the head that is not known. Who doesn't know it? Nobody. What about it itself? Doesn't know itself. Why? Because knowing, right, being unconscious. By the way, this gets into a whole discussion I don't want to go into right now, but if you take, this is just result of potential pleasure. But if you take this idea seriously and you really appreciate it, this also means something very interesting, which Liz talks a lot about. Do you know where you do have a connection to the pure you? In action. Because at the end of the day, action is something that you have to decide to do. And who's making the decision? You.
Your consciousness.
No. Your consciousness is where you are aware and where you play out the decision. The actual deciding is in you. The actual, and think about this, we attribute responsibility to you, right? This is the idea that we're judged by Hashem for our actions. So there's this deep connection between action and you, which kind of bypasses all of the experiential parts. Not that it's not that they don't play a role. Anyway, so it's like one of the reasons why action connects us to Hashem in a way that experiences don't. And part of the reason is because experiences are somewhat disconnected from both parties. If I'm aware of you and you're aware of me, then our connection is limited to that part, the awareness part. But you know, if I give you tzedakah, right, then the money that I owned now is yours. So there is some I-you connection that's much deeper. Anyway, those are ideas. But this is a hard thing. I'm not saying it's in any way easy. But if you really think about the idea that I is not something other than me, and you start thinking what's happening in consciousness and in awareness, you realize like consciousness is never just I, right? It's the arena in which what the awareness is playing out to me, and there's all sorts of objects that I'm aware of. You, for example. So, and then there's the question: how much is what's playing out in my awareness, right? Me, and how much is it not me? And pleasure is when it's being flooded by me, which is why it's very hard to describe pleasure other than after the word, like, that was good. It's about the only thing we can say about it is that was good.
wait, so pleasure is when like the you that's beyond your
Consciousness.
gets flooded into your consciousness.
Right.
So there's really no way to describe or point like.
Yeah. And so what does it mean to give God pleasure? It means that the ultimate goodness and truth and unity of his being is radiated purely into his, for lack of words, conscious, and then ultimately through that into a relationship with the world. By the way, this is also very helpful like in human relationships. If you realize that you can't give anybody pleasure, actually, it's not unique to God, you stop trying, which is really good.
It's not unique to God.
Yeah, you can't give anybody pleasure. Because the pleasure is what? The pleasure is coming from within themselves. So you can't give anyone pleasure. So instead of trying to worry about making people feel good, you know what you should probably worry about doing? Treating people properly. And there's a very big difference between those things.
But God told us how we can give him pleasure.
That's true.
Trigger it, I guess.
That's true. But what I mean to say is, like, but in other words,
It's not mean that Hashem is in touch with himself, that's beyond his consciousness, because he knows what's gonna make.
yeah, of course he is. This is where issues of language fail. In other words, we can't think. Yes.
Like if the system is that, I guess Hashem is beyond this.
What's it? Two things I want to tell you. One, the answer is yes. Two, though, the point you're making that seems a little bit violate is also true, because it does speak about the idea, like, for instance, for instance, you discover things about yourself through interacting with others. So the same dynamic does play out according to Kabbalah Chassidus, right? So for instance, like, ever notice that Judaism develops over time? Like, we end up having, like, rabbinic commandments. So in God's relationship with the Jewish people, and specifically Sanhedrin, right, God discovers that, like, oh, that's actually something that's really important. But he didn't actually say, right? And this gets into where you need more layers and more levels, and I don't want to go into all this stuff, but yes.
Is pleasure and feeling good two things?
No and yes. And what I mean to say is like this. The feeling good is what you describe pleasure, what it was like to have the pleasure. The more the pleasure feels good, the less pleasure it is. This is a weird type of a thing. I'll explain to you what I mean. In other words, if you're watching a movie, which I'm not recommending, if you're watching a movie and you're talking with your friend about the movie, you know what you're not doing?
Watching one movie.
Now, you're talking to your friend about the movie because you found the movie really engaging, right? Whatever, you found it interesting or whatever, but you're not watching it, right? And so there's this weird kind of thing. When you're no longer having the pleasure, but you recall that you had pleasure, it feels really good in retrospect. In other words, you can't stop a person in the middle of the things and saying, is this feel good right now? Like, that itself undermines the whole thing. Right? So what we call feeling good is a retrospective projection on pleasure. Which now means the easier it is to describe something as feeling good, that means that the pleasure was a more shallow, easier to move out of sense. Because if the deeper it was, what would happen? It would be harder to step out of it and actually describe it as, oh, that felt good. Which is often why the deepest pleasures are the most subtle. They're the hardest to articulate and to realize that you had until they're totally gone. Right? And then the other...
It's not right to articulate the deeper pleasures. Like what do you mean by deeper pleasure? Not something more.
The pleasure a person has, I'll give you two examples I'm after in the class. So let's talk about there's the pleasure somebody has from being a parent and the pleasure somebody has from taking a nice shower at the end of a hard day's work. Which one is easier for us to go, that felt really good?
It's hard to.
It's really because it's like it's when you to step out to describe something good, you have to step out of it and like look back at it as an experience, say that was. And the more it's really pleasure, the less it is. And so often when we start, this is one of the problems, this is known as the hedonist, right? But the more you chase pleasure, the harder it is to have it. Because you start focusing on the things that you can reflect back as having been pleasurable, which means, right? And so you end up like, so if you really want to have pleasure, you have to almost like try not to have the pleasure. And it's like very weird when you pursue pleasure. It messes with you. So there's like a nice saying, I don't remember where it's from, but it encapsulates very well, is that pleasure needs to ensue, means to be brought about, but not something you're supposed to pursue. You're not supposed to chase after it. And you'll notice this in life. If you try to do things because you think they're going to feel good, you'll start to realize that it's very hard to have these deep kinds of experiences of pleasure. But if you just try to live life in accordance with some truth of who you are, what you're supposed to do, you will discover that pleasures ensue, smaller pleasures, bigger pleasures. And the same thing with people, right? If you interact with people the way you should interact with them, what will happen? Pleasure, both on your end and on their own too. But if you try to make people have pleasure, you end up trying to like control them. It's like, you need to, like, you need to be this way. Like, how come you're not happy? I did all this stuff for you. It never works. Pleasure is not something you get from the outside. Pleasure is the deepest part of you coming from the inside out. Right? And it takes over. And at that point, you're not, like, you become disconnected from all the stuff that's that's not you. It's not really that core of yourself. And that's why it's used as an analogy to understand Hashem. Or one of the analogies. So tomorrow we will learn about the different types of